Hello, my listeners. Well, today is the 1st of December, um, uh, Friday 2023. Well, the year is almost ended, and this is retired Lieutenant Colonel Samsudeen Sarr being back again, continuing the reading of my book, Testimony of a Gambian Military Officer and a Diplomat. I will be reading chapter 28, and it's quite an extensive chapter, so you'll bear with me again. So, chapter 28, titled Circumstances Leading to President Jammeh's 2016 Downfall. The Vice President, Satu Job, attended the September 2015 one-week-long 70th anniversary of the United Nations General Assembly with a fairly large Gambian delegation. She read my speech, which I proudly and happily sat at the General Assembly Hall, absorbing every good feeling about my work. However, the annual event was to me a routine and very formal occasion, and our overcrowded office filled with guests who had little to do was perplexing. The heavy traffic in Manhattan during the period was another challenge. Nevertheless, by diplomatic standards, the occasion was considered successful, which was typical of the annual United Nations gatherings. To me, the United Nations seemed like an organization filled with bureaucrats whose roles were primarily to maintain a routine and formal system with limited powers and solutions. Different nations gathered in various committees to discuss and pass numerous resolutions, many of which were not effectively implemented. The dominance of feeding and intransigent superpower nations, prioritizing their national interest over global needs, controlled the narrative. African nations and others flowed with the system, fulfilling their representative obligations and benefiting from the associated luxuries. They seldom questioned the routine system, often voting in unison when endorsing or rejecting bills or resolutions, with the majority usually leaning towards the Western and American support, whose membership on the Security Council have been permanent. I remember once participating in a meeting where the subject was about the need to reduce the proliferation of small arms in Africa. But nobody seemed to understand or entertain my argument when I briefly deviated from the usual collective protocol and questioned why the weapon manufacturing industries in developed nations were not held accountable for the constant production and distribution of those small arms into the hands of poor Africans, and to a continent where no such weapons were manufactured. I even tried to explain how the serial numbers of every manufactured weapon in the world could be used to trace the manufacturers and distributors. However, the rapporteur quickly dismissed my question as irrelevant to the main subject. It was obvious that if the United States of America, the Russian Federation, China, the United Kingdom, and France, the 5 permanent members of the United Security Council, decide to prevent the passage or adoption of any resolution at the United Nations, regardless of its significance and urgency to the 193 member states, they can do so without encountering any obstacle. Take, for instance, the United Nations has been unable to allocate the 2 permanent and 3 non-permanent seats for Africa in the Security Council, a demand persistently made by the 54 African member states over the past 30 years, because the 5 permanent members of the Council are opposed to it. Furthermore, for more than 3 decades, a majority of United Nations member states have sought to establish 2 coexisting states in the Middle East, encompassing Israel and Palestine, as a solution to the enduring and volatile political crisis in the region. However, this aspiration remains elusive due to Israel's resistance to the creation of a Palestinian state, with explicit support from the United States of America, the United Kingdom, and France. Consequently, the realization of this goal remains uncertain. Similarly, for over 6 decades, the island state of Cuba has endured ceaseless sanctions imposed by the United States of America and Western nations due to its adherence to a socialist political and economic system, in contrast to Western democracy and capitalism. Despite the majority of United Nations member states deeming these sanctions unfair and inappropriate, and consistently demanding their cessation, for more than 30 years, the 3 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, America, France, and United Kingdom, insist on maintaining them. Consequently, the international community remains powerless to alter all these situations. Regardless of the disappointment and frustration in my United Nations job as Deputy Permanent Representative at the Gambia Embassy in New York for the 2 years I spent there, things took an interesting turn in October 2015. After the September United Nations General Assembly, President Jammeh tasked the mission with introducing a special resolution for Western nations responsible for the enslavement and colonization of Africa to pay reparations for the negative effects of the exploitation and underdevelopment of the continent. Official letters were written and signed by President Jammeh to be dispatched from Banjul for distribution to the Office of the United Nations Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, and to all embassies and consulates of the 193 member states in the United Nations organization. While the ambassador, Dr. Tonkara, was initially hesitant due to the office's lack of capacity in terms of experts, Jammeh assured him that he will send any number of experts necessary to fulfill the objective. The letters had to be distributed without delay, or the ambassador risked being fired. With the threat of dismissal looming, the ambassador acted promptly, and we managed to distribute all the letters within a day and a half. The next week, 3 young experts from Banjul arrived to help work on the resolution. Mr. Kambeng Tar, a Cameroonian legal expert from the Gambia Ministry of Justice, Mr. Amadou Jobate, a government lawyer also working at the Ministry of Justice, and Mr. Usman Tesco Joe, a career diplomat from the Gambia Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Kambeng Tar came on a temporary appointment to help initiate the process, while Jobate and Joe were to stay permanently until the resolution was passed. Although introducing the bill to the United Nations was not a problem, the challenge was justifying the proposal. Considering that similar demands for reparations by countries like South Africa and certain Caribbean nations in the past had failed. These countries had sought monetary compensation in large amounts from the accused European and American nations who did not agree to such demands. The task ahead was formidable, but with the enthusiasm and determination of the newly arrived experts, we were determined to make a compelling case for reparation at the UN. Hence, it was the South African mission at the UN that first asked to know what the Gambia had to present differently from their resolution to succeed where they failed. But whereas the South African bill introduced in 2003 was mainly about reparation to their country in the post-apartheid era, the Gambia was making it about the whole African continent with the intent to rebuild nations that have been rendered hopeless and useless after centuries of slavery, colonization, and exploitation. The Gambian Reparation Bill emphasized that it was not just about Europe paying checks to African nations, but a mutual benefit for both parties. It pointed out that in 2015, Europe faced an existential threat due to the uncontrollable and large number of migrants taking all risks to leave poor African countries for greener pasture in Europe. The volume of migration had turned into a crisis, and the only solution was to help build attractive nations in Africa, encouraging the youth to stay in their own countries. Instead of resorting to expensive measures such as arresting and detaining migrants in inhumane detention centers or turning a blind eye to their tragic deaths in the treacherous Mediterranean Sea, making Africa livable and attractive for its inhabitants should be a more affordable and humane solution. The current conditions in Africa would only continue to increase migration, regardless of the precautionary measures of the West, especially of the European Union. Moreover, it was noted that the issue extended beyond African migrants, as instability in the Middle East and beyond was also pushing more refugees to seek security and livelihood in Europe. The Gambia argued that if Africa received the necessary support to become an attractive place for its inhabitants, the influx of migrants towards Europe from all corners of the world will significantly decrease. This justification for reparation, developed at the Gambian mission in New York City, resonated with nations that had doubted about the proposal, gaining more support for the cause. By the time Mr. Kambengta returned to the Gambia after 3 months of introducing the resolution, a solid committee was established with the approval of the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to pursue the matter. The Gambia was henceforth recognized for spearheading a reparation bill calling for Western nations to repair the damage done to African nations. Mr. Ahmadu Chapate and Mr. Usman Tesco Job actively took part in the United Nations Committee to pass the resolution and remain hopeful that they will succeed in doing so in the end. Notwithstanding, the year 2016 started with the understanding that the Gambia will hold its presidential election, which was normally conducted every 5 years. President Jani had remained in power for the past 22 years after a military coup in 1994 and had consecutively won 4 presidential elections. The lack of a term limit in the Gambian constitution allowing him to seek a fifth term in December 2016. Although most Gambians opposing his government had little or no confidence in the Electoral Commission, despite its characterization as an independent electoral commission, people doubted the commission's credibility because the chairman and the principal officials were always appointed by President Jane and were believed to be under his influence. The main opposition party, the United Democratic Party, had contested in 4 presidential elections since 1996 under the leadership of lawyer Usman Drame, but had always lost to Jane's APRC party. Many Gambians argued that the UDP needed to change its presidential candidate to a younger and more charismatic one if they were to have a better chance of winning. However, effecting that change had proven elusive thus far. Consequently, most Gambian dissidents living abroad continue to believe that the only way to change the Jani government was by force, through armed insurrection, massive civil disobedience, or a military takeover. Several attempts were made by the Gambian armed forces to topple his government, but he had always survived, leading to most of the soldiers giving up on the idea. It could, however, be recalled that in December 2014, dissidents in the United States of America, under the sponsorship and leadership of Mr. Cherno Job, attempted to overthrow the APRC government by force, but they failed. The attackers were killed, and Mr. Job, the sponsor, was arrested and imprisoned in the United States of America, along with 3 of his Gambian American accomplices. Following this failure, the dissidents shifted their strategy from organizing armed attacks to inciting internal uprisings, inspired by the events in Burkina Faso in October 2014, where President Blaise Compaoré was ousted after 27 years in power. A particular Gambian American dissident group based in Washington, D.C., known as Democratic Union of Gambian Activists, DUGA, devised a new plan to organize an internal uprising in the Gambia with the hope of forcing President Jane to step down. They openly communicated their intentions and reached out to opposition party members in the Gambia, pledging to lead the civil disobedience when the time came. Despite their efforts, key opposition leaders, including Mr. Omar Jao of the PPP, Mr. Mbaye Silla of the DOI, and Mr. Amadou Baji of the NRP, publicly declined to participate. Around the same time, the United Democratic Party was facing a leadership crisis due to their leader, Usman Drame, being disqualified from contesting elections under a constitutional age limit clause. His supporters zealously opposed his disqualification and were determined to have the constitution amended to allow him to run again. President Jane, on the other hand, refused to entertain any amendments to the constitution to allow him to contest in 2016. This impasse over the constitutional amendment became a political storm in the country, providing the dissidents in the United States of America and abroad with an opportunity to fuel a political uprising. During that period of agitation, many of the facts behind the scenes were not known to the general Gambian public. However, as time progressed, particularly during the testimony of the affected individuals at the Gambia Truth, Reconciliation and Reparation Commission, TRRC, all the facts were ultimately laid bare and have been included in this book. For example, Mr. Lalo Kamben, the UDP youth leader who became a focal point for the foreign-sponsored resistance, was later disclosed to have no formal education and was not even a Gambian citizen, but rather hailed from Guinea-Bissau. Kambeng was convinced by the Duga activists that with their financial support, he could lead protest with or without government permits, claiming that the entire Gambia was fed up with the Jani government and will support their cause. Activists had before entertained a similar misconception in the past, leading to the armed attack in December 2014. The attackers had wrongly believed that the Gambia National Army soldiers were dissatisfied with the Jani government and will join them in overthrowing the APRC government. As a result, despite arriving with relatively sophisticated arms, ammunition, and equipment, expecting support from about 200 active duty GNA soldiers, they found nobody waiting to join them and walked into a deadly ambush where all of them were literally wiped out. Almost identically, Mr. Lalo Kambeng was persuaded by his Gambian sponsors, living mainly in America and Europe, that the country was fertile for a socially engineered revolution, with masses waiting for anyone to initiate it and bring an end to the APRC government. Kambeng and his close associates decided to act on April 14, 2016, a date that in the year 2000 was still remembered as the bloody demonstration of Gambian students against the APRC government, resulting in the death of 16 people, mostly students. On April 14, 2016, Lalo and his group assembled at the busiest street in Serekunda, the most populated city in the Gambia, to start the civil disobedience. They marched for almost 1 kilometer, chanting the need for electoral reform by the Independent Electoral Commission of the Gambia, claiming that it was incapable of organizing a free and fair election. It might have been expected that such a protest will be done at the IEC main office located in the city of Bakau, few kilometers away from Serekunda. However, their main intention was to fulfill the objective of their sponsors, who wanted them to start a revolution that will galvanize the population into action and bring about regime change. By the time the few protesters led by Lalo Kambeng arrived at the famous Westfield Junction, about a kilometer from where they started their march, the police paramilitary unit of the Gambia Police Force arrived in their riot control gears and roughly arrested and detained all of those who refused to run away. Most of the initial planners didn't show up or ran away when the police arrived. Only Kambeng and his close associates, who were paid to join, stayed around with him. Those who refused to run and tried to resist were indeed manhandled by the police and even beaten before loading them in an open truck and driving them away for detention. The whole thing ended faster than it had started. Shockingly, Mr. Lalo Kambeng was reported dead the following morning from being allegedly tortured at the NIA office in Banjul. Although the United Democratic Party leader, lawyer Usman Drame, had, in his first public statement about the incident, disassociated himself from the protest led by the youth leader of his party, pressure from the diaspora and the sponsors of the event eventually compel him to take a stand against the government. The NIA, or the government's stupidity, the NIA or the government stupidly refused to hand over the dead body of Kambeng and instead buried him at a secret place, reporting that he died from a pre-existing health condition. On April 16, the key members of the United Democratic Party executive, led by the party leader, lawyer Usman Drame, came out in the streets to demand that the APRC government handed over the body of Lalo Kambeng for normal burial. Their protest was considered illegal for not having a police permit, resulting in the arrest, detention, trial, conviction, and imprisonment for 3 years of all 19 members of the UDP executive who came out. The incident set the stage for all opposition parties in the country under the initiative of the Doi party leader Mbai Silla to come together in December 2016 to contest the presidential election against Jane and his APRC party. 7 parties came together and agreed on a memorandum of understanding to choose a temporary or transitional flag bearer who will contest on their behalf, but who would only serve for 3 years if elected instead of the constitutionally mandated 5 years. During these 3 years, the coalition or transitional government aimed to put in place a new constitution to replace the 1997 one and to further institutionalize democratic reforms that will bring about the necessary and permanent democratic conditions in the country. The transitional president will then resign and dissolve his government for all parties to contest in the subsequent presidential election. Curiously, Mr. Mbai Silla, the architect of the coalition concept and the driving force behind the historic change, found himself pushed aside in a voting system that favored the UDP candidate, Mr. Amadou Barry. Mr. Amadou Barry, the treasurer of their party, was the ultimate winner and flag bearer. While Barry was described as one of their most loyal supporters and an executive member of the party, many Gambians outside of the UDP knew little about him. He had not actively participated in the protests that led to the imprisonment of his colleagues, making him the fortunate one left to be chosen. But according to rumors, the United Democratic Party's leaders, the Democratic Party's jail party leader, lawyer Usman Drame, passionately opposed the idea of Amadou Barry as the flag bearer and instead suggested Dr. Satu Jata as a replacement. But the UDP members refused to select Dr. Satu Jata, who was an independent contestant and had previously declined their invitation to join the party. Consequently, Amadou Barry was chosen by the UDP, and he emerged as the winner in the secret balloting conducted by the coalition parties. This, as stated, led to Mbai Silla being sidelined despite being the mastermind behind the coalition. Yet, Mr. Silla remained the principal advisor to the coalition party members and to Amadou Barry throughout the campaign, leading up to the victory day when Barry was sworn in Senegal. Amazingly, at some point in Dhaka, Mari Hamed Fofana, the leader of the Gambia Moral Congress Party, one of the 7 members of the coalition, announced the dismissal of Mbai Silla as spokesman and advisor to Barry. Despite this dismissal, Silla maintained a seemingly healthy relationship with President Amadou Barry, but tensions arose when Mr. Lawyer Usman Drame and his jail colleagues were released from prison, and he literally took charge of the government's policies and appointments. It is notable that the party leaders of the coalition government who contested against Chani were all appointed to key government positions and diplomatic roles. Anyhow, none of the Doi party executive members, including Baisela and his team, were appointed to any position. There were speculations about a new government list allegedly prepared before the election, which included Barry as president, Baisila as vice president, and Sadia Jara, a Doi party stalwart, as foreign minister, along with other cabinet ministers. However, this purported transitional government based on the MOU was not widely discussed or implemented after the victory. The new government, influenced primarily by the new foreign minister, lawyer Usman Drame, and the United Democratic Party, eventually challenged and denied the validity of the MOU by claiming that it was never signed by the stakeholders. Lawyer Drame made controversial statements on national TV asserting that he would take anyone to court who insisted on President Barry stepping down after 3 years, as was agreed upon during the formation of the coalition. He was therefore blamed for undermining the whole MOU that was aimed at rectifying the lingering executive, legislative, and judicial problems of the country since the Gambia's independence from colonial rule. Lawyer Drame's rigid stance changed later when he was sacked by President Barry in March 2019, and he publicly supported the mobilization and protest by Gambians, mainly the United Democratic Party members, for President Barry to respect the coalition party MOU and step down after 3 years. In December 2019, a large crowd of Gambian opposition activists, again mainly from the UDP supporters, took to the streets to demand President Barry's compliance with the MOU and his resignation after 3 years. The protest began with a long march from the Combos towards State House in Banjul, but was forcefully dispersed by the Gambia police force. The leaders of the protest were arrested, tried, convicted, but later pardoned by the president, effectively marking the end of the once popular 3 years only resistance movement. Lola Ousainou Drame and the UDP had since emerged as the largest and most defiant opposition party to the government of President Amadou Barry. In contrast, the APRC party, which had been ousted in 2016, had now become an unexpected ally and staunch supporter of the new president and his government. This irony was not lost on many observers. And this ends chapter 28. Thank you very much for your patience, and Juma Mubarak. Till next time.